The Vanderbilt name once stood at the absolute peak of American wealth. At its height, it represented power so vast that it reshaped cities, controlled industries, and dictated the rhythms of everyday life across an entire nation. Fifth Avenue bowed to it. Railroads bent around it, European aristocrats sought it, newspapers treated it as untouchable. And yet, within a single lifetime, it vanished. Not slowly, not gently, and not because of war, taxes, or economic collapse. This is not a story about bad luck or outside forces. It is a story about what happens when wealth is mistaken for permanence, when inheritance replaces discipline, and when display becomes more important than purpose. The Vanderbilts did not lose their fortune because the world turned against them. They lost it because they never learned how to make it last. Behind the marble facades and glittering ballrooms was a family competing against itself. Palaces built to impress, parties staged to force acceptance, marriages arranged as transactions, fortunes divided, diluted, and consumed. Generation after generation inherited immense wealth, but almost no understanding of how it had been created or how easily it could disappear. This documentary follows that collapse from the inside, from the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man America had ever known, to the demolition of the mansions that once defined an era. From daughters sold into European titles, to heirs who gambled away entire fortunes, from a name that dominated New York society, to descendants who rebuilt their lives without relying on it at all. If you think the Gilded Age ended because of history, you may want to look closer. The ending began much earlier, and it began at home. If you want to understand how America's greatest fortune disappeared, why it could not survive its own success, and what this story reveals about wealth, power, and legacy, make sure to like this video and subscribe. This is the complete rise and fall of the Vanderbilt dynasty. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January of 1877, the United States paused to take stock of what he had accomplished. Newspapers devoted entire editions to his death. Editorials struggled to place him in context. Some called him ruthless. Others called him brilliant. No one disputed the scale of what he left behind. His fortune stood at approximately $100 million, a sum so large that it exceeded the entire United States Treasury at the time. Roughly $1 out of every 20 then in circulation belonged to him. In a nation still recovering from civil war, no private citizen had ever held comparable power over capital, transportation, or commerce. At a moment when the average American worker earned less than $500 a year, Vanderbilt's wealth existed on a scale that defied comprehension. He had begun with almost nothing, borrowing $100 from his mother to enter the ferry business. Over decades, he built a shipping empire, then dismantled it to dominate railroads instead. He crushed rivals, manipulated rates, absorbed competitors, and emerged as the undisputed master of American transportation. To many contemporaries, the fortune seemed indestructible. Empires had been built on far less and endured for centuries. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the bulk of this vast estate. Unlike many heirs, William Henry did not immediately squander it. In fact, he expanded it. Through aggressive consolidation and careful management of the railroads his father had assembled, he doubled the fortune in less than a decade. By the time William Henry died in 1885, the Vanderbilt wealth stood at roughly $200 million, an amount equivalent to several billion in modern terms. At the moment of his death, William Henry Vanderbilt was widely regarded as the richest man in the world. This is where the story is often misunderstood. Popular explanations for the disappearance of the Great Gilded Age fortunes usually point to external shocks. The federal income tax, introduced in 1913, is frequently blamed. World War I, with its disruptions and demands, is another convenient explanation. Others cite the speculative excesses of the 1,920 seconds followed by the Great Depression. These forces certainly reshaped American wealth, but they do not explain the Vanderbilt collapse. The timeline simply does not support that narrative. Within 30 years of Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, the family had already fallen from the ranks of America's wealthiest. By the early 20th century, long before the income tax reached its peak, before the First World War, and decades before the stock market crash of 1929, the Vanderbilt name no longer appeared among the dominant fortunes of the nation. This was not a gradual erosion caused by history grinding everyone down equally. Other families, operating in the same environment, followed very different trajectories. The Rockefellers were still rising. John D. Rockefeller would become America's first billionaire in 1916, nearly 40 years after the Commodore's death. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire for an unprecedented sum and devoted his remaining life to philanthropy, ensuring his legacy endured in institutions rather than buildings. The Morgans continued to wield financial influence well into the 20th century. These families faced the same taxes, the same wars, the same economic cycles. They did not disappear. Something else was happening to the Vanderbilts. The clues are not found in balance sheets alone, but in stone and marble, in the physical remains of what the family chose to build. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself lived relatively modestly. His Manhattan residence on Washington Place was comfortable but restrained. He had no interest in elaborate, entertaining, or architectural statements. Wealth, to him, was a tool. It existed to be deployed in business, to acquire leverage, to expand control. Display was unnecessary. His single major act of philanthropy, the founding donation for Vanderbilt University in Nashville, stood out precisely because he made so few gestures of that kind. His children and grandchildren approached wealth very differently. By the 1882nd, Fifth Avenue began to transform into a canyon of private palaces. One by one, Vanderbilt heirs commissioned enormous mansions designed to rival the aristocratic residences of Europe. These were not simply homes, they were declarations. Each new structure announced not only wealth but dominance within an intensely competitive social hierarchy. 10 Vanderbilt houses would eventually line Fifth Avenue, each striving to surpass the last in size, cost, and ornamentation. These buildings consumed staggering sums. Millions of dollars were poured into limestone facades, imported marble, carved woodwork, gilded ceilings, and art collections assembled at any price. Entire staffs were required to maintain them. Dozens of servants, chauffeurs, gardeners, cooks, and footmen. Coal bills alone reached levels that would have shocked even prosperous households. None of these structures produced income. They did not house businesses. They did not generate rent. They existed solely to be occupied, admired, and compared. What makes this especially revealing is what happened next. Within 70 years of Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, nearly every one of these mansions had been demolished. The famous Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882, was sold to a developer in the 1922nd and torn down almost immediately. The immense residence built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II at the corner of 57th Street met the same fate, replaced by a luxury department store. Even the so-called Triple Palace, which occupied an entire city block, survived only into the mid-20th century before giving way to commercial development. These houses were not lost to fire, confiscation, or public seizure. They were sold because the family could no longer afford to maintain them. The very symbols of Vanderbilt supremacy became financial liabilities. While the Vanderbilts were converting capital into architecture, other industrial families were doing something far less visible. John D. Rockefeller reinvested relentlessly. He established trusts, foundations, and governance systems designed to preserve wealth across generations. He emphasized modest personal living and institutional continuity over personal display. The Rockefeller fortune did not depend on individual heirs making wise choices. It was structured to survive their mistakes. The Vanderbilts built monuments. The Rockefellers built systems. By the early 1972s, the outcome of these contrasting philosophies was unmistakable. In 1973, approximately 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion. Observers noted, with some astonishment, that few, if any, attendees possessed significant wealth. The greatest fortune of the Gilded Age had effectively vanished. It had not been redistributed to the public or seized by the state. It had been spent. Responsibility for this collapse cannot be assigned to a single generation. The Commodore himself bears part of the blame. He built an empire but neglected to prepare those who would inherit it. He believed in discipline but practiced it through intimidation rather than instruction. His sons learned to fear his judgment rather than understand his methods. His daughters were largely excluded from meaningful engagement with the family's business affairs. Their futures assumed to lie elsewhere once they married. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he left most of his estate to William Henry, while allocating comparatively small sums to his daughters and an even more restricted share to his younger son, whom he distrusted. The resulting legal battles fractured family relationships and established an enduring pattern. Money would be distributed, but unity, purpose, and shared strategy would not. By the second generation, wealth was no longer something to be built. It was something that arrived automatically. By the third, it was something to be displayed. And by the fourth, it was something that had already begun to disappear. The critical mistake was not extravagance alone. Other wealthy families spent lavishly without collapsing. The fatal flaw was the absence of structure. Each heir received their share outright. No mechanisms limited spending. No institutions preserved capital. No shared vision aligned individual desires with long-term survival. Every mansion, every party, every transaction reduced the remaining pool of wealth, and nothing replenished it. The Vanderbilts assumed that because the fortune had been enormous, it was permanent. They mistook scale for durability. But wealth, unlike land or title, has no natural lifespan. Without deliberate effort, it dissipates. Divided among children, consumed by display, and unprotected by governance, it vanishes with remarkable speed. Long before taxes, wars, or economic crashes arrived, the Vanderbilt fortune was already hollowing out. The collapse did not begin with legislation or global conflict. It began in drawing rooms and ballrooms, in building projects approved without restraint, and in inheritances granted without responsibility. The end of the Vanderbilt Empire was not imposed from the outside. It was engineered quietly, generation by generation, from within. The moment the Vanderbilts forced their way into New York society, they became trapped by the very rules they had tried to overcome. Acceptance did not bring security. It brought obligation. Once admitted, they were required to perform their status continuously, visibly, and at ever-increasing cost. Old money families maintained their position through restraint, lineage, and exclusion. The Vanderbilts, lacking centuries of pedigree, relied on something far more fragile: spectacle. Nothing illustrates this transformation more clearly than the famous costume ball of the 26th of March, 1883. By that year, William Cassam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva had already achieved financial dominance. What they lacked was social legitimacy. Missus Caroline Astor, the undisputed gatekeeper of New York's elite, had not called on Alva Vanderbilt, a deliberate signal that railroad wealth remained unwelcome in the inner circle. In the language of Gilded Age etiquette, silence was rejection. Alva responded not with patience but with strategy. She understood that social power in New York was theatrical. It depended on attention, envy, and inevitability. She announced a costume ball of unprecedented scale, scheduled precisely when no rival hostess would dare to compete. Invitations went out to more than 1,000 guests. Reporters were invited to preview the decorations weeks in advance. Anticipation became unavoidable. The event could not be ignored. When Mrs. Astor finally sent her calling card, the balance of power shifted instantly. The Vanderbilt mansion had become socially real. Attendance was no longer optional. On the night of the ball, Fifth Avenue filled with spectators as carriages arrived in an endless procession. Police struggled to maintain order. Inside, nearly 1,200 guests moved through rooms, transformed into a fantasy of aristocratic Europe. Costumes consumed fortunes. Jewels were worn without restraint. The evening lasted until dawn. The ball succeeded completely. The Vanderbilts were accepted. Their social exile ended in a single night. But the price of that success was not measured only in money. It established a rule the family would never escape. Status had to be purchased repeatedly. One display was never enough. Each triumph created a new baseline. What impressed society one year would be expected the next, and surpassed the year after that. This logic extended far beyond parties. It shaped marriages, residences, and entire lives. Nowhere was this more consequential than in the treatment of Vanderbilt daughters. Wealthy sons inherited money and expectations. Wealthy daughters became instruments of exchange. Their marriages were not primarily personal decisions but financial and social strategies. By the 1892, a transatlantic market had emerged linking American fortunes with European titles. Britain's aristocracy possessed land, names, and castles, but many were cash poor. Agricultural depression had hollowed out traditional income streams. Meanwhile, American industrial families had unprecedented liquidity but no hereditary status. The solution was marriage. Consuelo Vanderbilt embodied this transaction. Intelligent, Educated and widely admired, she was also one of the richest heiresses in the world. Her mother, Alva, regarded her not as a daughter with independent desires, but as a resource to be deployed. When Consuelo fell in love with an American suitor, the relationship was destroyed. In its place appeared Charles Spencer Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, heir to Blenheim Palace, and burdened by enormous financial needs. The marriage that followed was meticulously structured. Millions in railroad stock changed hands. Annual incomes were guaranteed. A title was conferred. The exchange achieved its purpose. Blenheim was restored. The Duke's finances stabilized. The Vanderbilts acquired aristocratic legitimacy that no ball or mansion could provide. But the capital was gone forever. It flowed outward, across the Atlantic, sustaining estates and titles that would never generate returns for the family that funded them. This pattern repeated across the Vanderbilt lineage. Fortunes were not reinvested, they were exported, consumed, or immobilized. Wealth that once moved through rail networks and shipping lines now sat in stone palaces, European dowries, and seasonal social obligations. The family increasingly resembled an aristocracy without land, income, or institutional continuity. As the generations progressed, inheritance itself became destructive. Each division reduced the whole. Cornelius Vanderbilt II left behind a fortune that had barely grown over 14 years. The returns generated by investments were offset almost exactly by spending. His will exposed deep fractures. Children who displeased him were punished financially. Those who conformed were rewarded disproportionately. The result was resentment, fragmentation, and further division. When Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt inherited the symbolic leadership of the family, he possessed immense wealth but no mechanism to preserve it. His interests lay in sport, horses, and leisure. Divorce settlements consumed millions. Personal spending continued unchecked. When he died aboard the Lusitania in 1915, his fortune passed to his sons and fragmented once more. Other heirs fared worse. Reginald Vanderbilt burned through his inheritance with alarming speed. Gambling losses mounted. Alcohol consumption accelerated. By the time of his death in 1925, little remained. What survived was locked in trust for his daughter, Gloria, not as a sign of prudence, but because there was nothing left to access. The public watched this unraveling with fascination. During the Great Depression, the Vanderbilt custody trial became a national spectacle. The phrase, "poor little rich girl," captured the paradox perfectly. Immense wealth had not protected the child at its center. It had turned her into an object of conflict. The family's failures were magnified by the very fortune that once defined their power. Meanwhile, the world that had sustained the Vanderbilt lifestyle was disappearing. The introduction of the federal income tax placed ongoing pressure on large estates. The First World War transformed labor markets. Domestic service, once cheap and abundant, became scarce. Women found better wages and greater independence in factories and offices. Maintaining enormous houses with full staffs became increasingly impractical. Urban economics delivered the final blow. Fifth Avenue land values soared. A single city block could generate enormous commercial revenue. Private mansions made no financial sense. One by one, the Vanderbilt palaces were sold and demolished. Structures designed to proclaim permanence lasted barely a generation. Their materials were salvaged for museums and public parks, fragments of a vanished world preserved because no family could afford to maintain the whole. By mid-century, nothing remained of Millionaire's Row. The avenue that once symbolized private wealth now represented commercial modernity. Department stores and office towers replaced ballrooms and drawing rooms. The transformation was irreversible. The last chapter of the Vanderbilt story is not one of continued decline but of reinvention. Gloria Vanderbilt refused to repeat the family pattern. Rather than living off inheritance, she created something new. Her success in fashion marked a radical departure from generations of consumption. For a time, she reversed the narrative, turning the family name into a productive enterprise. But even that success proved fragile. Legal disputes and poor financial management eroded much of what she built. By the time of her death, the fortune that once rivaled governments had dwindled to a modest estate. Her son, Anderson Cooper, completed the reversal. He rejected inheritance entirely, building a career independent of the family name. In the end, the Vanderbilt collapse was not mysterious. It followed a clear trajectory. Wealth was created through work, risk, and structure. It was preserved briefly through expansion. Then, it was converted into display. Finally, it was divided, consumed, and dispersed. No trust protected it, no institution governed it, no shared mission sustained it. The lesson is neither moral nor sentimental. It is structural. Wealth that is not actively maintained disappears. Fortunes do not survive on memory, names, or buildings. They survive on systems. The Vanderbilts built monuments. Others built continuity. The difference determined which names endured as living power and which remained only in history books, attached to photographs of houses that no longer stand. By the time the Vanderbilt name began to fade from the lists of America's great fortunes, the family had already entered its most dangerous phase. The money was no longer concentrated, no longer controlled, and no longer connected to any productive enterprise. It existed in fragments, scattered across heirs, who had inherited wealth but not responsibility. What had once been an engine became residue, and residue does not endure. The central problem was not extravagance alone, it was fragmentation. The Commodore had understood concentration of power. He believed control created leverage, and leverage created survival. His descendants inherited the results of that philosophy without understanding its necessity. Each generation divided what came before, assuming that sheer scale would protect them. But scale collapses quickly when divided repeatedly. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died at the turn of the century, his estate revealed how little progress had been made since his father's death. 14 years had passed. Investments had produced returns. Railroads continued to generate income. And yet the fortune was essentially unchanged. The growth had been consumed. The system had stalled. Money came in and went out at nearly the same rate. This equilibrium might have lasted indefinitely if the family had remained small and disciplined. It did not. Inheritance created multiple centers of spending with no coordinating authority. Each heir operated independently, guided by personal taste, social pressure, and ambition. There was no shared investment office, no family council, no trust structure that could say no. Money moved outward in dozens of directions at once, financing houses, stables, yachts, divorces, allowances, travel, and social obligations that never ended. The effect was cumulative. What one heir spent seemed negligible against the scale of the whole. What 10 heirs spent became significant. What 30 heirs spent became fatal. The arithmetic was relentless. Wealth divided is wealth diminished. And once diminished, it becomes vulnerable. The Vanderbilts also misunderstood time. They believed their position was permanent because it had been dominant for their entire lives. They mistook personal memory for historical reality. But dynasties that endure think in centuries, not seasons. European aristocratic families survived because land produced income regardless of individual behavior. Titles passed intact. Estates were entailed. American fortunes lacked those safeguards. Without deliberate structure, they evaporated. By the early 20th century, the family's spending habits collided with a changing world. The social economy that had rewarded spectacle began to shift. Old money families quietly retreated from public display. New wealth moved into finance, industry, and later technology. The markers of status evolved. Ballrooms mattered less. Office towers mattered more. The Vanderbilt style of wealth became obsolete. Labor changes accelerated the collapse. Domestic service had once been the invisible foundation of elite life. Immigrant women cleaned rooms, cooked meals, and maintained households for low wages and few alternatives. Industrialization altered that equation. Factories offered better pay, regular hours, and independence. The servant problem, as wealthy families called it, was not a temporary inconvenience. It was the end of an era. Without large staffs, the great houses became unmanageable. Maintenance costs soared while functionality declined. What had once been a sign of prestige became a burden. Heating alone consumed enormous resources. Taxes climbed, repairs multiplied. Families began selling houses not because they wanted to, but because there was no rational alternative. Urban economics sealed their fate. Fifth Avenue land became too valuable to waste on single-family residences. Commercial developers offered sums that dwarfed any sentimental attachment. Selling was inevitable. Demolition followed quickly. The city absorbed what had once excluded it. Each fallen mansion sent a message the family could not ignore. The past was no longer sustainable. The world no longer rewarded their form of dominance. And yet, there was no return path. The railroads were gone. The shipping lines were gone. The businesses that had created the fortune were no longer under Vanderbilt control. What remained was identity without infrastructure. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt name persisted primarily as history. Museums preserved fragments of their world. Universities carried the name. Guidebooks described vanished palaces. But the family itself no longer shaped American life. Its members lived private, often ordinary lives, supported by professions rather than patrimony. This transition was not uniform. Some descendants adapted earlier than others. Those who recognized the danger of inheritance sought independence. Those who did not repeated familiar patterns. The difference lay not in intelligence or character but in environment. Heirs raised amid discipline learned caution. Heirs raised amid indulgence learned entitlement. The family never reconciled these approaches. Gloria Vanderbilt's story illustrates this divergence. Raised under scrutiny, stripped of parental stability, and made famous against her will, she developed a complex relationship with wealth. She experienced both privilege and deprivation. She understood the danger of passive inheritance. When she built her fashion brand, she did so with urgency, not entitlement. For a brief period, she reversed the family narrative. But even reinvention could not fully escape legacy. Advisors failed her. Lawsuits drained resources. The fortune she built did not enjoy the protection of institutional structure. It eroded over time. Still, the significance of her success was symbolic. She proved that the Vanderbilt name did not doom its bearer to repetition. It could be repurposed. Anderson Cooper carried that lesson further. He rejected inheritance as identity. He treated the family story as caution rather than entitlement. His career reflected a return to first principles. Work created value. Value sustained independence. Independence protected purpose. In this sense, the cycle completed itself. The great fortune began with self-reliance and ended with it. What remains of the Vanderbilt empire is not money, buildings, or power. It is evidence. Evidence that wealth is fragile. Evidence that inheritance without education is dangerous. Evidence that display consumes what production creates. And evidence that systems matter more than sums. The Gilded Age produced many fortunes. Some endured, most did not. The Vanderbilt collapse stands out not because it was inevitable, but because it was avoidable. The family had every advantage. Capital, influence, time. What they lacked was restraint and structure. They believed the name would carry them forward. History proved otherwise. The story ends not in ruin but in clarity. Wealth is not a state of being, it is a process. When that process stops, the decline begins immediately. The Vanderbilts did not lose their fortune in a single moment. They spent it, divided it, and ignored it until nothing remained worth protecting. And by the time they noticed, the age that had made them possible was already gone. By the time historians began to treat the Vanderbilt collapse as a case study rather than gossip, the lesson had already hardened into something uncomfortable. The family did not fall because it lacked intelligence, access, or opportunity. It fell because it never decided what wealth was for. Once that question went unanswered, every choice that followed pulled the fortune further apart. In the earliest years, money had a function. For Cornelius Vanderbilt, capital existed to control movement. Ferries, steamships, railroads, these were systems. They created cash flow, leverage, and dominance. Each acquisition reinforced the next. The fortune was not static, it was active. It demanded attention, discipline, and constant reinvestment. Cornelius did not think of himself as rich. He thought of himself as building. That mindset vanished quickly. When William Henry Vanderbilt doubled the fortune, it appeared that the system would continue. But even then, the nature of the wealth had already begun to change. William Henry managed assets rather than expanding them. He consolidated rather than innovated. His success was real, but it was defensive. He preserved and amplified what already existed. He did not create a new engine. When he died, the last generation capable of maintaining the original machinery disappeared with him. What followed was not stewardship but inheritance culture. Inheritance culture operates on assumption. It assumes tomorrow will resemble yesterday. It assumes income will continue without intervention. It assumes scale replaces strategy. The Vanderbilts had no reason to doubt these assumptions until they failed. Each heir grew up surrounded by abundance, insulated from consequence, and trained primarily in social performance. They learned how to host, how to dress, how to belong. They did not learn how to build. The American environment made this failure more dangerous than it would have been elsewhere. European aristocracies survived decline because their wealth was anchored to land and law. Entails prevented fragmentation. Titles carried obligations as well as privileges. American fortunes lacked these guardrails. Capital moved freely. Property could be sold. Money could be spent without oversight. The very flexibility that allowed fortunes to be created allowed them to vanish. As the 20th century advanced, this structural weakness collided with modernization. Industrial capitalism evolved into corporate capitalism. Individual dynasties lost relevance as institutions replaced families. Railroads became regulated. Shipping consolidated. Banking professionalized. The age of the lone industrial titan ended. Families that adapted transformed themselves into investment organizations. Families that did not became spectators. The Vanderbilts remained attached to identity rather than infrastructure. Their name carried historical weight, but it no longer carried economic power. This distinction mattered. Identity alone cannot generate income. It can only consume it. Once consumption becomes the primary activity, decline accelerates. The public sensed this long before the family admitted it. Newspapers that once chronicled Vanderbilt parties began reporting on sales, demolitions, and lawsuits. The tone shifted from awe to curiosity, then to judgment. The family's missteps became morality tales. Excess turned into caution. The rich were no longer envied without reservation. They were scrutinized. The Great Depression intensified this scrutiny. As millions struggled to survive, stories of squandered millions felt obscene. The Vanderbilt name, once synonymous with success, became associated with waste. The family did not lose its fortune during the Depression, but it lost something equally valuable: legitimacy. The social license that had once excused extravagance disappeared. At the same time, American values were changing. Merit replaced lineage as the preferred explanation for success. Work replaced inheritance as the moral foundation of wealth. The self-made man returned as the national ideal. In this climate, dynastic failure was not tragic. It was instructive. Some descendants internalized this shift. They moved quietly into professions: law, art, journalism, business. They chose anonymity over expectation. Others clung to vestiges of status that no longer carried weight. The divergence within the family widened. There was no longer a single Vanderbilt story. There were many small ones, disconnected and often contradictory. The disappearance of the mansions symbolized this fragmentation. These buildings had been designed as anchors, physical proof of permanence. Their destruction sent a clear message. The past could not be preserved through architecture alone. When the buildings fell, so did the illusion that the family still occupied a unified place in American life. Museums absorbed the remnants: fireplaces, gates, staircases. Objects once meant to glorify private wealth were repurposed for public education. This transformation was not accidental. It reflected a deeper truth. The Vanderbilt fortune had outgrown private justification. Its remnants belonged to history, not to heirs. What makes the Vanderbilt collapse enduringly relevant is not its scale, but its predictability. The warning signs were visible early. Concentration gave way to division. Division gave way to competition. Competition gave way to consumption. At no point did the family collectively intervene. There was no moment of recalibration. Each generation assumed the next would manage somehow. This assumption proved fatal. Wealth, when unmanaged, behaves like entropy. It spreads out. It dissipates. It loses coherence. Without active effort, it does not remain where it began. The Vanderbilts treated wealth as an object rather than a process. Once the process stopped, the object disappeared. The final irony is that the family ultimately produced what the Commodore valued most: self-made success, but only after the fortune was gone. Those who thrived did so precisely because they were no longer supported by inheritance. Necessity replaced entitlement. Effort replaced assumption. The pattern that built the empire returned only after its collapse. This is why the Vanderbilt story endures. It is not simply about rich people behaving badly. It is about systems failing silently. It is about how success plants the seeds of its own undoing when it is mistaken for permanence. And it is about how quickly advantage becomes liability when structure disappears. In the end, the Vanderbilt name survives not as power but as proof. Proof that wealth is temporary. Proof that inheritance is fragile. proof that display is not durability, and proof that the most dangerous moment for any dynasty is the one in which it believes it has already won. The Gilded Age promised permanence through abundance. The Vanderbilt collapse exposed the lie beneath that promise. Nothing lasts without purpose, nothing survives without discipline, and nothing disappears faster than a fortune that forgets why it exists. As the Vanderbilt fortune dissolved into history, its disappearance revealed a truth that extends far beyond one family. The collapse was not dramatic in the way financial crashes are dramatic. There was no single headline announcing the end, no sudden bankruptcy, no moment when the accounts hit zero. Instead, the fortune faded through a long series of ordinary decisions, each one defensible on its own, devastating in accumulation. This slow erosion is precisely what makes the story so instructive. The Vanderbilts never experienced poverty as a collective shock. Each generation still lived well. Each heir still occupied beautiful homes, traveled extensively, and moved within elite circles. The illusion of continuity masked the reality of decline. Wealth did not vanish all at once, it thinned, and thinning wealth is far more dangerous than sudden loss, because it encourages complacency. By the early 20th century, the Vanderbilt name still opened doors, but the capital behind it no longer carried the same force. Banks extended credit based on reputation. Society pages still printed the name with reverence. This social momentum delayed reckoning. It allowed spending patterns to continue long after they should have been reconsidered. Reputation acted as a buffer, but buffers only slow impact. They do not prevent it. One of the most significant errors the family made was confusing social capital with economic capital. Social capital is symbolic. It relies on recognition, prestige, and access. Economic capital is functional. It generates income, absorbs shocks, and compounds over time. The Vanderbilts invested heavily in the former, while steadily neglecting the latter. Over time, the imbalance became unsustainable. This confusion affected how decisions were made. Investments were judged not by return but by appearance. Houses were built not because they made sense, but because rivals had built them. Marriages were encouraged not for stability but for status. Even philanthropy, when it appeared, was often performative rather than structural. Money was spent to be seen, not positioned to endure. As American capitalism matured, this approach became increasingly obsolete. The 20th century favored scale, efficiency, and abstraction. Wealth moved into corporations, securities, and managed funds. Families that adapted embraced professionalization. They hired managers. They separated ownership from control. They accepted that personal oversight could not scale indefinitely. The Vanderbilts resisted this shift. Their wealth remained personal, emotional, and reactive. This resistance was partly cultural. The family's identity had been forged in direct confrontation. The Commodore had dominated by force of will. His descendants inherited the myth of individual command without inheriting the environment that made it effective. In a world of complex institutions, personal dominance mattered less than systems and process. The Vanderbilt style of authority no longer fit the landscape. Another factor was internal fragmentation. As the number of descendants grew, shared identity weakened. Family cohesion eroded. Without a unifying mission or governance structure, cooperation gave way to parallel lives. Each branch pursued its own priorities. There was no mechanism to align interests or resolve disputes. Litigation replaced consensus. Silence replaced strategy. The absence of shared purpose also affected how the family remembered itself. The Commodore's story became legend, repeated but not examined. His methods were admired but not replicated. His discipline was remembered, but his restraint was not. Over time, the story hardened into myth, and myth replaced instruction. The past became something to celebrate rather than something to learn from. This shift is subtle but crucial. Families that preserve wealth treat history as a manual. Families that lose it treat history as decoration. The Vanderbilts admired their origin story without extracting its lessons. They honored the name without understanding the work behind it. In doing so, they severed the connection between identity and behavior. Public perception evolved accordingly. As the family's influence waned, their story was reinterpreted. What had once symbolized ambition came to symbolize excess. What had once inspired awe began to inspire critique. Journalists, historians, and eventually economists pointed to the Vanderbilts as an example of what happens when wealth lacks structure. The family became a case study rather than a benchmark. This transformation was not malicious. It was analytical. The Vanderbilt collapse offered data. It illustrated patterns that could be measured and compared. Researchers studying generational wealth found similar outcomes across cultures and eras. Most fortunes dissipate within 3 generations. The Vanderbilts simply provided a highly visible example. What distinguishes their story is the clarity with which the mechanisms are exposed. There were no hidden losses, no secret embezzlements, no catastrophic miscalculations. The fortune was spent openly, legally, and proudly. Every mansion, party, and dowry was documented. The decline was not concealed. It was celebrated until it could no longer be ignored. In this sense, the Vanderbilt story is not tragic in the classical sense. It is instructive. It demonstrates that wealth does not decay because people are foolish, but because systems are absent. Even intelligent, educated, well-connected individuals will deplete resources if no framework exists to guide behavior over time. The final phase of the story underscores this point. Those who rebuilt independent success did so by rejecting the assumptions that destroyed the fortune. They worked within institutions. They accepted limits. They separated identity from inheritance. Their success did not restore the family's dominance, but it restored something more durable: autonomy. By the time the Vanderbilt name ceased to represent concentrated wealth, American society had already moved on. New fortunes emerged in oil, automobiles, aviation, and technology. These fortunes faced the same risks. Some learned from history, others did not. The cycle continued, as it always does. What remains unique about the Vanderbilts is not their fall, but how completely it illustrates the life cycle of wealth: creation, expansion, display, division, dissolution. Each phase followed logically from the one before it. At no point was the outcome inevitable. At every stage, different choices could have altered the trajectory. That they were not made is the lesson. In the end, the Vanderbilt collapse reveals something uncomfortable but universal. Wealth magnifies character, but it does not replace judgment. It amplifies choices, but it does not correct them. Without intention, it becomes noise, loud, impressive, and fleeting. The mansions are gone. The fortune is gone. The name remains, detached from power and free of obligation. What survives is understanding. And understanding, unlike money, compounds when it is passed on deliberately. This is why the story continues to matter. Not because of what the Vanderbilts had, but because of what they lost and how easily it happened. By the time the Vanderbilt story reached its quiet conclusion, the forces that had undone it were no longer unique. They had become part of a broader pattern in modern capitalism. What made the family remarkable was not that they lost their fortune, but that they lost it so visibly, so thoroughly, and so predictably. Their experience stripped away the romance of wealth and exposed its mechanics. At the center of that exposure is a simple truth: money does not remember how it was made. Only people do. When those people disappear, the memory must be preserved deliberately, or it fades. The Vanderbilts allowed that memory to dissolve. The knowledge that built the empire was never institutionalized. It lived in one man, briefly in his son, and then vanished. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood leverage intuitively. He knew that owning the means of movement meant owning commerce itself. He understood choke points, pricing power, and consolidation long before these ideas were formalized in textbooks. His descendants inherited the results of that insight, but not the insight itself. Railroads became abstractions. Dividends became entitlements. The link between control and consequence was severed. Once that link was gone, money lost its moral weight. It no longer represented effort, risk, or sacrifice. It represented identity. Being a Vanderbilt became the achievement. Everything else existed to support that role. Houses were built to announce it. Balls were thrown to confirm it. Marriages were arranged to elevate it. Spending became proof of worth. This inversion was fatal. In functional dynasties, identity follows contribution. In failing dynasties, contribution follows identity or disappears entirely. The Vanderbilts crossed that threshold early. By the third generation, the question was no longer how to grow the fortune, but how to live up to it. That question has no sustainable answer. The American environment accelerated this collapse because it rewarded reinvention rather than inheritance. Titles meant nothing. Names carried influence only briefly. Markets were indifferent to lineage. Capital flowed toward efficiency, innovation, and scale, not pedigree. Families that adapted survived by turning themselves into institutions. Families that clung to personal dominance faded. The Vanderbilts never made that transition. They did not professionalize. They did not delegate. They did not separate emotion from strategy. Financial decisions remained personal, reactive, and symbolic. The result was predictable volatility. Wealth moved with moods, relationships, and social pressure rather than long-term planning. The absence of internal accountability compounded the problem. No one could say no. No one had authority to impose limits. Every heir had access. Every expense was justified by comparison to someone else's. This dynamic turned competition inward. The family no longer competed with rivals. It competed with itself. Each member became both consumer and benchmark. This internal rivalry explains the excess of the mansion era. The houses were not built because shelter was needed. They were built because someone else had built one. Architecture became escalation. Each new project reset expectations. Costs ballooned, not because of necessity, but because moderation looked like weakness. The same pattern appeared in social life. Parties escalated, guest lists expanded, entertainment budgets exploded. Acceptance was never final. It had to be reaffirmed constantly. Old money families could withdraw and remain relevant. The Vanderbilts could not. Visibility was their currency. Without it, they feared exclusion. This fear drove decisions that drained capital with no return. It also distorted relationships. Children were raised as symbols. Marriages became negotiations. Loyalty was conditional. Approval was transactional. Over time, the family lost not just money, but cohesion. The psychological toll of this environment should not be underestimated. Living inside a declining fortune creates anxiety without urgency. There is always enough left to avoid crisis, but never enough to feel secure. This limbo encourages denial. Problems are postponed, responsibility is deferred, the future becomes someone else's concern. That future arrived anyway. As the 20th century advanced, the Vanderbilt lifestyle became unsustainable not just financially, but culturally. The public mood hardened against visible excess. Progressive reform, labor movements, and economic upheaval reshaped attitudes toward wealth. What had once been admired was now questioned. The family's habits, once aspirational, began to look out of step. The demolition of the mansions symbolized this shift. These were not acts of vandalism. They were acts of replacement. Commerce replaced display. Utility replaced symbolism. The city absorbed what private wealth could no longer justify. This was not punishment. It was evolution. Each fallen building marked a transfer of relevance. The Vanderbilts did not move forward with the city. The city moved forward without them. By mid-century, the family's influence existed almost entirely in retrospect. Historians documented their rise. Tour guides narrated their decline. Museums preserved fragments. But the family itself no longer shaped outcomes. Its members lived within systems built by others. This is where the story becomes universal. The Vanderbilt collapse is not about arrogance alone. It is about inertia. Success creates habits. Habits resist change. When environments shift, those habits become liabilities. Without conscious adaptation, even the most powerful advantages turn against their holders. The final generations of Vanderbilts encountered a world that rewarded initiative, not inheritance. Those who adapted survived comfortably, if quietly. Those who clung to legacy struggled. The family ceased to function as a collective force. It became a surname shared by individuals with little in common beyond ancestry. And yet, in this fragmentation lies a kind of resolution. The disappearance of the fortune released later generations from its weight. Without the expectation to maintain palaces or dominate society, they were free to define themselves. Some did so successfully. Others lived ordinary lives. Both outcomes represented a return to normalcy. The Vanderbilt name now exists primarily as history. It evokes an era rather than a power. It signifies what was possible and what was squandered. It reminds us that wealth, like empire, is temporary unless actively sustained. The ultimate lesson is not moral condemnation. It is structural clarity. Wealth requires purpose. Purpose requires discipline. Discipline requires systems. Remove any one of these, and decline begins immediately. even if it takes decades to become visible. The Vanderbilts removed all three. They assumed purpose without defining it. They rejected discipline as unnecessary. They never built systems to replace the man who created them. The result was inevitable, even if it unfolded slowly. What remains is not tragedy, but evidence. Evidence that no fortune is too large to fail. Evidence that legacy cannot survive on memory alone. And evidence that the most dangerous moment for any dynasty is the moment it stops asking why it exists. That is why the Vanderbilt story endures. Not because of its splendor, but because of its clarity. As the Vanderbilt fortune receded into memory, the family's story became increasingly detached from money and increasingly attached to meaning. What had once been a narrative of conquest and accumulation turned into a meditation on limits. Not limits imposed by law or circumstance, but limits imposed by human behavior when structure disappears. The Commodore had understood limitation in one crucial sense. He knew that markets punished weakness and rewarded control. His ferocity was not random, it was disciplined. He reinvested relentlessly, avoided unnecessary display, and treated wealth as a tool rather than an identity. His life was defined by motion routes, schedules, contracts, and leverage. He did not confuse admiration with success. Profit was the only applause he trusted. That clarity died with him. In the generations that followed, wealth ceased to be a means and became an environment. Children were born into it, surrounded by it, protected by it. They did not encounter money as something earned or risked, but as something ambient, like air. When money is invisible, its loss is unimaginable. This psychological distance proved as destructive as any external force. The family's internal culture reinforced this blindness. Vanderbilt children were raised to represent something, not to produce something. Their education emphasized refinement, taste, and social fluency. These qualities had value, but they were not sufficient. Without corresponding instruction in discipline, restraint, and stewardship, refinement became indulgence. Taste became justification. Social fluency became dependence. This dependence on wealth as an environment rather than a tool created a subtle paralysis. Decisions were made to preserve comfort rather than ensure survival. Risk was avoided, but not in the productive sense. The family avoided the risk of innovation while embracing the risk of consumption. They clung to known pleasures rather than unknown opportunities. Meanwhile, the world rewarded the opposite behavior. American capitalism in the 20th century increasingly favored abstraction. Wealth moved away from tangible assets like land and railroads toward financial instruments, corporate equity, and managed portfolios. Control no longer required physical dominance. It required information, organization, and patience. Families that adapted to this shift prospered quietly. Families that did not became footnotes. The Vanderbilts never truly entered this new phase. Their wealth was never fully reorganized to match the modern economy. Even when trusts existed, they were fragmented and limited. There was no central investment philosophy, no long-term capital preservation strategy. Each heir acted independently, often advised by professionals who served short-term interests rather than family continuity. This fragmentation made the fortune vulnerable to exploitation. Advisors, lawyers, and intermediaries extracted fees. Legal disputes drained resources. Poor oversight allowed mismanagement. None of this was catastrophic on its own. Together, it accelerated decline. Public fascination with the family persisted even as their power waned. Newspapers chronicled scandals, divorces, and sales. The Vanderbilt name became a headline without substance. This attention created a feedback loop. Visibility encouraged behavior that sustained interest rather than stability. Private decisions became public entertainment. The custody battle over Gloria Vanderbilt epitomized this transformation. The trial was not merely about a child, it was about the collapse of authority within the family. Competing adults fought for control of a fortune that no longer protected anyone involved. The courtroom replaced the boardroom. The spectacle replaced strategy. For Depression-era Americans, the trial was irresistible. It confirmed a suspicion that wealth did not guarantee wisdom. It suggested that privilege could amplify dysfunction rather than prevent it. The phrase "poor little rich girl" endured because it captured this contradiction perfectly. Wealth had become a liability. As decades passed, the Vanderbilt story shed its immediacy, and gain distance. It became history rather than news. But the lessons sharpened with time. Scholars examining intergenerational wealth identified the same patterns repeating elsewhere. Without governance, fortunes dissipate. Without education, inheritance becomes burden. Without purpose, money destroys what it touches. The Vanderbilts provided a complete data set. From creation to collapse, every phase was documented. There were no missing chapters. This completeness is why their story remains relevant. It allows observers to trace cause and effect without speculation. It also strips away comforting myths. The collapse was not caused by bad heirs alone. Many heirs were intelligent, cultured, and well-intentioned. Nor was it caused by envy or regulation. Other families navigated the same environment successfully. The difference lay in structure. Structure is unglamorous. It does not photograph well. It does not inspire gossip. It operates quietly, often invisibly. But it is the only force that allows wealth to survive beyond the individuals who create it. The Vanderbilts rejected structure because it felt unnecessary. By the time it became necessary, it was too late. In the end, the family achieved an unintended equality. Stripped of overwhelming fortune, later generations lived lives shaped by work rather than inheritance. Some found fulfillment, others found anonymity. Both outcomes represented a return to proportion. The Vanderbilt name remains etched into American geography and memory. Universities bear it. Museums display fragments of it. Tourists walk through surviving summer houses and imagine a world of endless abundance. But that world was brief. It existed for a moment, sustained by a single man's discipline and vision. When that discipline vanished, the illusion collapsed. What the Vanderbilt story ultimately reveals is not the fragility of wealth, but the fragility of intention. Money follows intention. When intention is clear, money multiplies. When intention fades, money scatters. No amount of capital can substitute for purpose. This is the quiet ending of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Not with ruin or disgrace, but with dispersal. The fortune returned to the economy that created it, absorbed into cities, industries, wages, and institutions. The name survived as a reminder, not a power. And perhaps that is the final irony. The Commodore believed in work above all else. He distrusted inherited ease. He feared softness more than failure. In losing his fortune, his descendants unknowingly fulfilled his worldview. They proved that without effort, nothing lasts. The Vanderbilt story does not warn against wealth. It warns against forgetting why wealth exists. By the time the Vanderbilt fortune fully dissolved, the broader American economy had already absorbed its remains. This absorption is important because it reveals how wealth truly ends not with disappearance, but with redistribution into systems that no longer remember its source. The rail lines were sold, merged, regulated, and renamed. The land beneath demolished mansions became offices, stores, and apartments. The capital once concentrated in a single family flowed outward, financing industries, wages, institutions, and cities that no longer bore the Vanderbilt imprint. This is how great fortunes usually end. They do not vanish. They dissolve. The Vanderbilts never experienced a moment when the money was simply gone. What they experienced was a steady erosion of influence. Each generation still lived comfortably. Each generation still believed there was enough. And because there was always enough for one more house, one more season, one more indulgence, the urgency to change never arrived. Decline disguised itself as continuity. This gradualism is what makes generational collapse so difficult to detect from the inside. People adjust their expectations downward without realizing it. The first generation flies private rail cars. The second flies first class. The third flies commercial. Each still feels privileged compared to the average citizen. None feels impoverished. But the trajectory is unmistakable in hindsight. The Vanderbilt heirs lived through this normalization of decline. What had once been unimaginable wealth became simply comfort. What had once been dominance became reputation. What had once been power became memory. And memory cannot generate income. The family's final error was assuming that reputation itself could substitute for capital. For a time, it could. Banks extended credit. Society offered access. Journalists offered attention. But reputation decays when it is not reinforced by substance. Eventually, the name became historical rather than functional. It evoked the past, not the present. At that point, the family had no leverage left. Without concentrated assets, they could not influence markets. Without institutions, they could not coordinate action. Without a shared mission, they could not act collectively. Each descendant existed as an individual rather than as part of a dynasty. The Vanderbilt family ceased to exist as an economic entity. This transition happened quietly. There was no announcement, no obituary for the fortune. It simply stopped appearing where power was exercised. And once power is gone, attention follows. The family faded from relevance not because people stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to respond to. What replaced the Vanderbilt model of wealth was something fundamentally different. The 20th century favored abstraction. Ownership separated from management. Corporations replaced families. Wealth became fractionalized through shares and funds rather than embodied in individuals. This system was less romantic, but far more durable. It did not depend on heirs being competent or restrained. It relied on rules. The Vanderbilts never embraced this transformation. They remained attached to personal ownership and personal discretion long after those models became liabilities. Their wealth remained emotional. It carried meaning, memory, and expectation. It was never reduced to numbers on a balance sheet governed by policy. As a result, it remained vulnerable to human weakness. This vulnerability expressed itself repeatedly. Divorces extracted enormous settlements, advisors siphoned fees, legal disputes drained resources, poor investments went uncorrected. None of these alone would have destroyed the fortune. Together, they ensured it could not recover. The family story also reveals how wealth can distort perception. Heirs raised in abundance often mistake comfort for security. They confuse continuity of lifestyle with continuity of capital. But lifestyle is a lagging indicator. It reflects past success, not future viability. By the time lifestyle must change, the underlying capital is often already gone. This lag explains why the Vanderbilts continued to behave as though they were secure long after they were not. Their houses still stood, their names still appeared in print, their social invitations still arrived. But the foundations beneath these signals were eroding. The collapse was invisible until it was irreversible. The public, observing from the outside, sensed this contradiction. Fascination turned into judgment. Admiration turned into critique. The family became an example rather than an aspiration. This shift mattered because social acceptance had once been the justification for so much spending. When acceptance no longer required spectacle, spectacle lost its purpose. By mid-century, the values that had once sustained Vanderbilt excess had inverted. Frugality became respectable. Professional success became admirable. Inherited leisure lost its prestige. The family's remaining members adapted unevenly. Some embraced work and independence. Others struggled to redefine themselves without the scaffolding of inherited identity. This struggle highlights another often overlooked aspect of generational wealth collapse: identity loss. When a family's sense of self is tied to dominance, its decline creates an existential vacuum. Who are you when the thing that defined you no longer exists? The Vanderbilts never answered this question collectively. Individuals answered it privately, with varying degrees of success. Gloria Vanderbilt answered it through creation. Anderson Cooper answered it through career. Others answered it through anonymity. None attempted to resurrect the dynasty itself. That option was no longer available. At this point, the story ceases to be about the Vanderbilts specifically and becomes about wealth more broadly. The same forces that destroyed their fortune continue to operate today. Scale without structure, inheritance without education, identity without purpose. These dynamics repeat across cultures and eras. The names change, the pattern does not. Most fortunes do not survive beyond 3 generations. This statistic is often quoted, rarely examined. The Vanderbilt story explains why. It is not because heirs are universally incompetent or lazy. It is because wealth, left unmanaged, obeys entropy. It spreads, fragments, and dissipates. Only deliberate intervention prevents this outcome. That intervention must be institutional. It must outlive individuals. It must impose limits when emotion would not. The Vanderbilts rejected this necessity because it felt unnecessary when the fortune was vast. By the time necessity was obvious, it was too late. The final legacy of the Vanderbilt fortune is therefore not its loss, but its redistribution. The money did not disappear into a void. It became wages, investments, buildings, endowments, and public institutions. In a sense, The fortune fulfilled a broader social function after it ceased to serve a private one. This reframes the collapse as transformation rather than failure. The wealth that once supported private excess ultimately supported public life. The mansions became museums or rubble. The railroads became infrastructure for millions. The capital returned to circulation. From this perspective, the Vanderbilt story ends not with tragedy, but with absorption. The family's experiment with extreme private wealth concluded, and the resources it had accumulated re-entered the systems that created them. The dynasty ended, the economy continued. What remains is understanding. Understanding that wealth is not an object to be possessed indefinitely. It is a force that must be guided, or it will dissipate. Understanding that inheritance is not preservation unless it is paired with responsibility. And understanding that the most dangerous belief any wealthy family can hold is that the future will resemble the past. The Vanderbilts believed that. And in believing it, they proved the opposite. By the time the Vanderbilt story reached its final, quiet stage, the dynasty no longer resembled the force that had once reshaped American life. What remained was not power, but aftermath. The name persisted in archives, stone carvings, university seals, and museum labels, but it no longer functioned as a lever in the real economy. The transformation from dominance to detachment was complete. This final phase is often misunderstood because it lacks drama. There were no last mansions seized, no final fortunes gambled away in a single night, no courtroom verdict declaring the end. Instead, the Vanderbilt collapse resolved itself through normalization. The family became ordinary, not poor, not destitute, but unremarkable. And for a dynasty built on being exceptional, that was the true ending. Ordinariness arrived not through catastrophe, but through time. As decades passed, the Vanderbilt descendants entered professions, married outside elite circles, and raised children who knew the family name more as history than expectation. The psychological pressure that had once defined Vanderbilt identity dissipated. There were no palaces left to maintain, no social obligations that required ruinous spending, no titles to defend. The burdens that had destroyed the fortune vanished alongside the fortune itself. In this sense, the collapse was also a release. For generations, Vanderbilt heirs had lived under a contradiction. They were expected to embody wealth without understanding it. They were expected to preserve status without possessing control. They were expected to live expansively without building anything new. These expectations produced anxiety, competition, and excess. When the money disappeared, so did the expectations. This helps explain why later descendants often spoke of the family legacy with ambivalence rather than regret. Anderson Cooper described inherited wealth as corrosive. Gloria Vanderbilt referred to self-earned money as more real. These statements were not moral posturing. They reflected lived experience. Inherited abundance had not empowered them. It had constrained them. The Vanderbilt story thus inverts a common assumption about wealth. It suggests that extreme inheritance can be as limiting as poverty, though in different ways. Both remove agency. Poverty restricts options through lack. Inherited wealth restricts options through excess. In both cases, individuals must struggle to reclaim autonomy. What makes the Vanderbilt case especially revealing is that this struggle played out publicly, across generations, in full view of the nation. Their rise coincided with the birth of mass media. Their decline unfolded alongside it. Newspapers, magazines, and later historians chronicled each stage, turning private decisions into public lessons. Those lessons extend beyond family dynamics. They illuminate how capitalism itself evolved. The Vanderbilt fortune was built in an era of personal capitalism. Individual men controlled vast enterprises directly. Their will shaped markets. Their decisions affected millions. This form of capitalism rewarded aggression, consolidation, and scale. Cornelius Vanderbilt mastered it. But capitalism did not remain personal. As enterprises grew more complex, they required bureaucracies. Regulation increased. Ownership dispersed. The system favored institutions over individuals. Families that adapted survived by turning themselves into organizations. Families that did not became relics. The Vanderbilts never completed this transition. Their wealth remained personal even as the economy professionalized. They treated capital as something to be owned, not managed. This mismatch proved fatal. When personal oversight became insufficient, there was nothing to replace it. This distinction matters because it reveals that the Vanderbilt collapse was not merely a family failure, It was a failure to adapt to structural change. The skills that built the fortune were no longer sufficient to preserve it. The family mistook historical success for permanent advantage. History punished that mistake. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt name had lost its strategic value. It could not command markets or shape policy. It could not mobilize capital at scale. It could not even guarantee prestige. The family had become symbolic rather than functional, and symbols without substance eventually fade. The endurance of the Vanderbilt story comes from this clarity. It strips away comforting narratives about merit, destiny, or inevitability. It shows that wealth is contingent. It depends on behavior, structure, and environment. Remove any one of these, and even the largest fortune dissolves. This is why the Vanderbilt collapse continues to resonate in discussions of modern wealth. It challenges the assumption that scale alone protects capital. It demonstrates that without governance, inheritance accelerates decay, and it exposes the limits of display as a substitute for productivity. The lesson is not that wealth should be hidden or denied. It is that wealth must be directed. Purpose matters. Systems matter. Education matters. Without them, money becomes noise, loud, impressive, and transient. In the end, the Vanderbilt fortune did exactly what unstructured wealth always does. It returned to circulation. It became part of the broader economy. It funded buildings that house workers rather than families. It supported institutions rather than lineages. It lost its name, but not its utility. This outcome may seem ironic, but it is consistent with economic reality. Capital seeks use. When private hands cannot deploy it effectively, it flows elsewhere. The Vanderbilts did not lose their fortune to enemies. They lost it to entropy. And entropy is indifferent to names. The final Vanderbilt descendants live without palaces, without dynastic obligation, without expectation of dominance. They live as individuals, judged by their work rather than their ancestry. In this sense, the dynasty ended where it began, with self-reliance. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing and built everything. His descendants inherited everything and lost it. The pattern only reversed when later generations rejected inheritance as identity and returned to work as purpose. That is the quiet conclusion of the Vanderbilt saga. Not a moral fable, not a tragedy, but a structural truth revealed over time. Wealth, left alone, does not last. It must be guided, constrained, and renewed. When it is not, it disappears slowly, visibly, and completely. And that is why the Vanderbilt story endures. Not because of the fortune itself, but because of what its disappearance teaches. By the final decades of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt dynasty no longer functioned as a family story of wealth at all. It had become something else, a historical demonstration of how power behaves when it outlives its foundation. What once looked like dominance now read as excess. What once felt inevitable now appeared fragile. Distance clarified what proximity had concealed. The family's decline revealed that the most dangerous phase of wealth is not its creation or even its expansion, but its normalization. When extraordinary resources become ordinary, they stop being managed and start being assumed. Assumption is where discipline ends, and discipline, more than money, is what sustains empires. Cornelius Vanderbilt never assumed. He calculated. Every decision he made was anchored to leverage. His wealth existed to serve strategy. He did not build houses to display success. He built routes to control commerce. The houses came later, built by those who inherited outcomes rather than processes. That distinction explains everything that followed. As the Vanderbilt fortune passed through generations, the connection between cause and effect weakened. Railroads paid dividends without requiring involvement. Investments generated income without demanding attention. The effort that once justified the reward disappeared from view. Wealth began to feel self-generating, as though it existed independently of human action. This illusion is one of the most consistent features of inherited wealth. It convinces recipients that money is stable rather than conditional. Stability encourages confidence. Confidence discourages scrutiny, and without scrutiny, decay accelerates. The Vanderbilts lived inside this illusion for decades. Their environment reinforced it. Servants maintained order. Lawyers handled details. Advisors smoothed problems. Social structures absorbed missteps. The family rarely encountered consequences proportional to their decisions. When consequences did arrive, they arrived slowly, diffused across time and heirs. This diffusion masked responsibility. No single person could be blamed for the collapse. Each heir inherited a situation already weakened, each spent within norms established by predecessors. Each believed decline would stop with someone else. In this way, collective failure emerged without individual villains. This is why the Vanderbilt story resists moral simplification. The heirs were not uniquely foolish or malicious. They behaved as many would behave under similar conditions. The difference was scale. Their mistakes were magnified because their resources were vast. Their visibility ensured their errors would be remembered. As the family's power waned, the American public's relationship to wealth evolved as well. The late 20th century did not revere inherited status. It admired innovation. Entrepreneurs replaced aristocrats as cultural heroes. Fortune became respectable again only when tied to creation rather than consumption. This shift further marginalized families like the Vanderbilts. Their story belonged to an earlier economic era. It did not align with the values shaping modern capitalism. The family's remaining prominence existed primarily in historical comparison, not contemporary relevance. Universities bearing the Vanderbilt name continued to thrive. Museums displayed fragments of their houses. Tourists walked through surviving estates in Newport and imagined a vanished world. These institutions preserved memory without preserving power. They transformed private excess into public education. This transformation is significant. It suggests that wealth ultimately finds its highest use not in private display but in collective benefit. The Vanderbilt fortune, once freed from dynastic obligation, became more productive than it had ever been as a symbol of status. The money funded institutions that endured far longer than any mansion. In this sense, the dynasty's collapse completed a redistribution cycle common in capitalist societies. Wealth concentrates, dissipates, and re-enters circulation. Families act as temporary custodians rather than permanent owners. The Vanderbilts resisted this idea until it was forced upon them. The emotional dimension of this transition should not be underestimated. Losing relevance is more painful than losing money. Money can be replaced. Identity cannot. For a family accustomed to defining itself through dominance, irrelevance felt like erasure. Yet it also brought relief. Later generations spoke openly about this relief. Without the pressure to uphold a name, they could pursue lives shaped by choice rather than obligation. The loss of fortune removed a burden that had distorted relationships and priorities for generations. This paradox, that collapse can liberate, is rarely acknowledged in discussions of wealth. The Vanderbilt story makes it unavoidable. Their decline freed them from an impossible standard. It allowed individuality to replace performance. It restored proportion. This does not mean the collapse was harmless. Enormous sums were wasted. Opportunities were lost. Human relationships were damaged by coercion, competition, and neglect. But it does mean the story is more complex than failure alone. It is also about misalignment. The family's values stopped matching its environment. Their behavior belonged to a social economy that no longer existed. When the environment changed, they did not. Collapse followed. This pattern continues today. Industries rise and fall. Fortunes emerge and disappear. The names differ, but the mechanism remains the same. Wealth tied to obsolete models does not survive. Only those who adapt endure. The Vanderbilt collapse therefore offers a warning, not only to families, but to institutions. Past success does not guarantee future relevance. Scale without flexibility becomes rigidity. Identity without purpose becomes liability. What made the Commodore successful was not his money, but his adaptability. He moved from ferries to steamships to railroads as conditions changed. His descendants inherited the results of that adaptability without inheriting the habit. They mistook the outcome for the skill. That mistake is easy to make and hard to correct. By the end of the Vanderbilt saga, the fortune had become something abstract. It existed only in adjusted dollars and historical comparisons. What remained tangible were lessons. Lessons about governance, education, restraint, and purpose. Lessons about the limits of inheritance. Lessons about the difference between owning wealth and understanding it. The dynasty ended not with scandal, but with quiet absorption into the society it once dominated. Its name persists, but its power does not. That outcome may feel anticlimactic, but it is fitting. The Vanderbilt story does not end with triumph or tragedy. It ends with equilibrium. The family returned to the condition from which it began, individuals navigating a larger system. subject to the same forces as everyone else. In that return lies the final meaning of the collapse. Wealth can elevate, but it cannot exempt. It can amplify, but it cannot insulate forever. Without structure and purpose, even the greatest fortunes resolve back into the world that created them. And that is where the Vanderbilt story rests, not as legend, but as evidence. By the time the Vanderbilt dynasty had fully dissolved into history, what remained was not mystery, but pattern. The arc of the family's rise and fall followed a logic so consistent that it now reads less like tragedy and more like anatomy. Every stage of the decline can be traced, not to bad luck or outside enemies, but to predictable shifts in behavior once wealth outlived its original purpose. The Commodore's fortune was born in scarcity. Scarcity imposes discipline. Every dollar mattered because it had been fought for. Every risk carried consequence. This environment sharpened judgment. It rewarded focus. It punished waste. Cornelius Vanderbilt's worldview was forged under these conditions, and it never softened. He trusted work. He distrusted comfort. He believed wealth existed to be used, not admired. His descendants inherited abundance instead. Abundance removes friction. It softens consequence. It allows mistakes to be absorbed without immediate pain. Over time, this insulation becomes dangerous. When people are protected from the cost of error, error multiplies. The Vanderbilts lived inside that protection for generations. What changed most dramatically was not how much money they had, but how they related to it. For the Commodore, money was external. It was something to be chased, seized, and deployed. For his heirs, money was internal. It was identity, expectation, and reassurance. It followed them everywhere. They did not have to pursue it, it pursued them. This inversion altered decision-making at every level. When money is external, decisions are cautious. When money is internal, decisions are expressive. Spending becomes a way to signal who you are, rather than what you are building. The Vanderbilt heirs expressed themselves endlessly. They built houses as statements. They hosted events as declarations. They married for symbolism. None of these expressions generated renewal. Expression without renewal leads to exhaustion. The family also confused legacy with preservation. They believed honoring the Commodore meant living grandly under his name. In reality, honoring him would have meant replicating his discipline. Instead, they replicated his outcomes. They enjoyed the reward without sustaining the process. This misunderstanding was fatal. Legacy is not memory, it is behavior repeated under new conditions. The Vanderbilts treated legacy as static. The world treated it as conditional. As the American economy matured, the space for dynastic dominance narrowed. Markets professionalized. Regulation increased. Corporate governance replaced individual command. Families that adapted created offices, boards, and rules that separated emotion from capital. Families that did not were exposed to personal volatility. The Vanderbilts remained personal long after personal capitalism ceased to function. Their wealth moved with marriages, divorces, feuds, and preferences. It was never insulated from individual impulse. This made decline inevitable, even if it unfolded slowly. The family's internal relationships further accelerated collapse. Children were raised to perform rather than to prepare. Obedience was rewarded. Independence was punished. This dynamic produced heirs who either rebelled destructively or complied passively. Neither outcome produced stewardship. Fear also played a role. Fear of exclusion, fear of appearing diminished, fear of breaking continuity. These fears drove spending decisions that appeared confident but were fundamentally defensive. The mansions, the parties, the social contests, all were attempts to freeze a moment in time. They were acts of preservation, not growth. But preservation without adaptation is decay. As decades passed, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The Vanderbilt lifestyle demanded infinite resources. The Vanderbilt fortune was finite. Each generation assumed the gap could be closed later. Later never came. When the Great Depression arrived, it did not destroy the Vanderbilt fortune. It revealed its weakness. The family had already lost resilience. The crisis simply removed the remaining illusions. What survived did so because it had been placed beyond individual control. What did not survive had been left exposed. The custody battle over Gloria Vanderbilt symbolized this exposure. Money no longer protected. It attracted conflict. The fortune became a prize rather than a foundation. The public watched, not with envy, but with recognition. The spectacle confirmed that wealth alone does not create stability. This shift in public perception mattered. The social environment that had rewarded excess no longer existed. What had once impressed now repelled. The Vanderbilts found themselves defending behaviors that no longer carried prestige. Their cultural capital evaporated alongside their financial capital. By mid-century, the family had lost the ability to define itself collectively. There was no longer a central figure, no shared strategy, no unifying mission. The Vanderbilt name fragmented into individual biographies. Some were successful, some were troubled. None represented a dynasty. This fragmentation is the natural endpoint of unstructured inheritance. Without cohesion, identity dissolves. Without identity, collective action becomes impossible. The family did not so much fall as disperse. The final irony is that the Vanderbilts eventually became what the Commodore would have respected: individuals judged by their own work. Gloria Vanderbilt earned her success. Anderson Cooper earned his. Their achievements did not restore the dynasty, but they restored agency. In rejecting inheritance as entitlement, they reclaimed purpose. The dynasty's collapse thus resolved a long-standing contradiction. The Commodore despised weakness born of unearned privilege. His descendants lived inside that privilege until it destroyed their position. The family only recovered its balance when privilege no longer defined it. This outcome reframes the story's meaning. The Vanderbilt collapse was not simply failure, it was correction. The system returned the family to equilibrium by removing what it could not sustain. Excess burned away. What remained was proportion. From a historical perspective, this is not unusual. Dynasties rise quickly and fall slowly. Their decline is rarely dramatic because it is distributed across time. Each generation inherits a slightly smaller burden until the burden disappears entirely. What makes the Vanderbilt story endure is its clarity. Every stage of decline is visible. Every choice is documented. The family's decisions were not hidden. They were celebrated. This transparency allows observers to trace cause and effect without speculation. It also allows modern audiences to see themselves in the story. The same dynamics operate today in different forms. Fortunes built in technology, finance, and industry face similar risks. Scale creates complacency. Inheritance creates assumption. Display replaces direction. Without conscious intervention, the pattern repeats. The Vanderbilt collapse therefore functions as a warning without moralism. It does not condemn wealth. It explains it. It shows what wealth requires to survive and what happens when those requirements are ignored. In the end, the dynasty did not vanish because it was hated, taxed, or sabotaged. It vanished because it forgot why it existed. Once that happened, money became an end rather than a means. And money treated as an end eventually consumes itself. The Vanderbilt name remains etched into American history, not as a symbol of endurance, but as a case study in impermanence. Its story reminds us that wealth is not an inheritance to be protected, but a responsibility to be renewed. That lesson is the true legacy of the Vanderbilt dynasty.